Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this BERA webinar series focusing on emotions and moral learning in early childhood education. My name is Nikki Fairchild, and I'm one of the conveners of the Early Childhood Education and Care SIG. Today, I'm alongside Janet Orchard from the Philosophy of Education SIG. This event is a collaboration between BERA's Philosophy of Education and Early Childhood Education and Care SIGs. We are pleased to welcome our panel of speakers today, who will explore and discuss a number of questions on the role of emotions and social interaction in moral learning. These questions are: what is moral learning at the early stages of education? What role do the emotions and social interactions with caregivers, practitioners, teachers and peers play in children's early stages of moral learning? How should we assess children's moral development? And how can we improve children's moral development? The format of the session will run as follows. Katrina, who unfortunately cannot present today, has recorded a short presentation of her thoughts. This will be followed by a response from Daniel. Then there'll be a panel discussion with Daniel and Alex, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions as the presentations are given via the Slido app. And at the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, and Janet will pose some questions to Daniel and Alex that you've uploaded during the presentations. So it's my pleasure to welcome the panel. Katrina Card is an experienced early years teacher and religious education subject lead and teaches in a reception class at a large primary school in Scunthorpe. She is a member of the executive of the National Association of Teachers of Religious Education and has presented both locally and nationally on early years RE. Katrina is currently undertaking research in the field of RE in the early years and also has a keen interest in young children's emotional development. Daniel Bonello is currently Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow in the Philosophy Department at Warwick University. His project, Shaping Our Moral Identity, investigates from an interdisciplinary perspective the role of social interaction and emotional development in moral learning and how this relates to the development of identity in early childhood. Prior to joining Warwick, Daniel was a postdoctoral research fellow at University College Dublin and at the Centre for Affective Studies at the University of Geneva. And Alex Sabine has worked as a nursery manager, both in a preschool and a nursery setting, and has over 6 years' experience with children who have severe speech and language difficulties. He has also been teaching in higher education since 2013 and is currently the course leader for the Early Childhood Studies BA Honours Programme at the University of Portsmouth. In addition, he's co-chair of the Early Childhood Studies Degrees Network. Alex's research interests are in ways of integrating school and local communities in cultural exchange and collective regeneration of physical and social environments. So now I'd like to hand you over to the presenters.
Hello, I'm Katrina Card. I'm really sorry that I'm not with you live today due to circumstances beyond my control, but I'm really pleased to be able to record my ideas to share with you my thoughts. I've been a primary teacher for over 25 years. Almost all my teaching career has been in infants, and over half of my career has been teaching early years, both nursery and reception, although I currently teach reception. I'm very interested in children's personal, social and emotional development. I'm very fortunate to receive some excellent training in this area locally in the past, and also to work very closely over the last few years with our local support services. My other key interest is religious education. I've been an RE subject leader for almost my entire career, and for the last 7 years almost, I've been a member of the NATRE, the National Association for Teachers of Religious Education Executive. RE is one of the subjects where children can really ask big questions, and those questions relate also to issues around morals and morality, and where people get their beliefs about morals from. And that's not just religious beliefs, that also includes non-religious worldviews, as I'll make clear. I've also been fortunate over the last couple of months, as we've been preparing this, to have some meetings with Daniel where he's talked about his research and what he's developing, and those have really caused me to think about the opportunities I have to support children's moral development and how I make best use of that. I'll try to highlight some of the changes I've started to make in my practice this year as a result of those conversations as I go through my presentation. So I'm now going to share my screen with you, if you'll just bear with me a second. So over the past few years, we've noticed, my colleagues and I, that children seem to be starting school with less language of emotions, that the language they're using around emotions is very limited. Often, in a lot of cases, even with children with quite good vocabulary in other areas, happy, sad, and mad, meaning generally angry, cross. And we realised that this was having a real impact on children's ability to talk about their own feelings, to recognise the feelings of others, to talk about feelings of characters in books, the reason people acted why they did. And so we started thinking about ways to support this language of emotions in order to support emotional development and talking about emotions. And so what we started to do was to make use of the little emoticons. So we would start by having a small selection of emoticons, and we would talk to children about how they thought these characters were feeling, what feelings were they showing, and then we would increase their range of feelings words, and we would try and include words so that they had a range within emotions. So, for example, that happy is a perfectly good word in some circumstances, but that actually you might be delighted, so that the children had a range of vocabulary to express someone being more than just happy, that you could be frightened or you could be terrified, and that being terrified is stronger than being frightened, so that children were able to express how strong that emotion was within themselves. And we'd use these with stories. We'd use these when we were having just discussion with children about how they were feeling, but in particular, to introduce them, we would use them with stories. So we would be reading a story and we would be talking about how a character was feeling, and we might start by asking the children, rather than naming the feeling, to choose the emoticon picture. We'd have them cut out and laminated, sat in the middle of the circle, that they thought best summed up the character's feeling. If there was a picture in the story, then the children might be choosing the one that they thought best matched the picture they could see. If it was just words, then we would ask them to find the picture that they thought. That might then develop to, how do you think that character might be feeling? Which picture would best sum up how you think the character would be feeling? Or a character's done something, how do you think someone else is in the story is going to be feeling? As an aside from that, last year when children were seeing people wearing masks, including staff around school, I actually took my emoticons and put a piece of white paper across the mouth part of the emoticon, showing the children that actually just the eyes gave you quite a good clue as to how the character was feeling. You can see from the selection I've put on my screen that the eyes are changing shape according to how the character's feeling, the eyebrows are moving. Now, obviously, this is very stylized, but that is actually what happens, obviously, on a human face, that people's expression changes, including where their eyes are. If you're genuinely feeling an emotion, then it's not just your mouth that shows it. And we did find that this worked quite well for a lot of children, and that they were able to develop a broader language. And we did find children saying to another child, sometimes when they were in discussions or maybe in their free play, oh, I think that person is happy. No, he's not frightened, he's terrified. So we knew that for some children at least this language was really going in, and that they were beginning to develop that language and therefore were able to talk about their emotions more effectively. We also try to support children who are struggling with that by labeling their emotions for them. So if they're struggling to talk about how they're feeling, I can see you're feeling sad, I can see you're feeling angry, or I think you might be feeling sad, I think you might be feeling angry, so that the children are able to have those words given to them. And also being honest with children about our own feelings. So if we're feeling sad, saying so, or if something has made us cross, using the word cross, saying I'm feeling cross at the moment, rather than using the word sad when actually we mean cross, because I feel that sometimes people don't like to use the word cross, and so they use the word sad, which can confuse children. Like a lot of schools, we have the golden rules from Jenny Moseley. Obviously, they have both the positives and the negatives, and I know Daniel has talked. I've talked with Daniel about the do nots and the do's. We do try and focus on the do's, and to go with our golden rules posters, we also have the books and the characters, which are quite nice, and the children like the stories. And I don't know, some of you might be familiar with the stories, but in the stories it takes a rule and then it shows the little animal characters and their teacher, Miss Beanie, and the little animal characters do things that are breaking one of those golden rules, and then the teacher talks to them about what's happened because they've broken that golden rule, and then the characters then resolve the issue, and they then start keeping the golden rule, and all ends well. And as a result of my conversations with Daniel this year, when we started working on the golden rules, we were listening to the story of We Are Gentle. I made time to talk to the children about how did they think various characters were feeling in the story, and if this happened, how would that character feel? How would it make that character feel? And if somebody acted differently, then how would that character feel? So trying to help them to think about the fact that there's an emotional impact to what they do. Now, for most children, these conversations they work as part of the class, and they're getting the idea of those emotions. We've also this year got a range of books, storybooks that are around emotions, which we can read to the children. And again, those take the children through a character feeling a particular way. Maybe they're feeling worried, and then they talk about what the character does in order to solve their problems. Or often, a lot of them, they give advice to other characters in the story about what they should do when they're worried, and then obviously it then turns out the first character gets worried, and the characters they have given the advice to give their own advice back to them, and lo and behold, it works. But we do have some children, obviously, for whom this is still very, very difficult, that they really are struggling to handle those big emotions, those big feelings, and therefore to make the right choices, as we might put it. That's one of the places where those conversations about I think you might be feeling, I can see you're feeling an emotion. So I can see you're feeling sad, I can see something's made you feel sad, I can see you're feeling worried. can you tell me about what's made you feel sad? That's a technique that we've learned from some of our local support teams. And it does take a lot of time. And I think that's one of the other things that I was reflecting on when I was talking to Daniel, was that in order for this development to happen, there has to be time given. The key of the positive relationship, the key of spending time having conversations with children about what's happened, how they're feeling, what made them feel that way, how can we change that feeling, what can they do, or what can we help them to do, what can we provide that will help them to come out of the other side of that feeling, deal with that feeling in a positive way. That's something we're still working on. It's a biggie, and I think there's quite a lot of things that I'm still thinking about from my conversations with Daniel. The other area that I do feel supports moral development is religious education. In early years, we do have personal, social, and emotional development. Obviously, in the rest of school, that's PSHE, and the emotions largely are not explicit within that curriculum. And it's much more around health and relationships and keeping yourself safe in those kind of ways. So RE does provide that space for thinking about those big questions and asking those questions that do link to moral development. And of course, some of that will be around a religious worldview, but it won't all be. So just got a couple of examples from our local agreed syllabus where the units of work have links in them to moral development. So we have a unit around My Friends, which talks about the golden rule, treat others as you would be treated, and the fact that that's common to many religions, and in fact to non-religious worldviews as well, that idea of treating others as you would like them to be treated. I think people with non-religious worldviews would also say that that would be part of what they would want as well. And then a unit around the world, which talks about beliefs about caring for the natural world, caring for the environment. So in our work on, for example, the natural world, we would look at religious teachings and how for some people their views of what their moral duty is towards the world would come from a religious text. So we might look at the creation story and the instructions in there. We might look at what Muslims believe about the natural world, and there's some really nice resources out there. One of the things that we found harder to find has been really nice resources that include non-religious worldviews for early years. However, I've been really fortunate to be involved with some work with someone called Jill Vasey, who runs a company called Books at Press, and she's got some lovely resources around children with different worldviews, including a child from a humanist family, and that's given us a really excellent resource to think about how someone with a non-religious worldview has a reason to act the way they do, that it's not just because, that there's morality sitting behind there, and morality that's not coming from a religious viewpoint. And so Wilf and his humanist family talk about the importance of caring for the world and caring for each other and caring for others around them, including people they don't know. And so that is supportive of children recognising that you don't have to have a set of religious beliefs in order to believe that that there are things that you do because they're right to do. And we also think in our RE, linking it in with PSED, about what that might mean for us. So, for example, when we're thinking about caring for the world, one of the things we often look at is things around litter, and then thinking to helping the children think about how that makes them feel and what they might do, actions they can take, and why they would want to take them. So again, linking to that thought that we want children to do things because they can see there's a reason to do it, and they're thinking about how it will feel if you do those things, and how it will feel if you don't, and how it will make you feel, how it will make others feel. So I think that is all I can really share with you at the moment. Thank you very much for listening. As I said before, I'm sorry I can't be there live. I hope that this has been useful. Thank you.
So thank you very much for Katrina for starting us off with some food for thought as we move through the presentations. Now we're turning into the live section, so I'm going to hand over shortly to Daniel, who will start to talk and provide a response back to Katrina. It will then move into a discussion between Daniel and Alex when there'll be some questions and answers posed from the Slido app. So please do keep posting as you talk. But now on over to you, Daniel.
Hi, first of all, thank you for everyone to be here. And also a special thank you to Catriona, though in absentia, for such an insightful talk. I think that especially us academics have to start learning that it's incredibly important, indeed the need to start learning from practitioners, especially in research areas like moral development. And I think that this is precisely a case in point. So what I want to do today in the next half hour or so is just to present some of the research that I've been doing at Warwick and Dublin and Geneva that I think is relevant to the conversations, the very fruitful conversations I've had with Catriona in the past months. And in order to do so, I want to ask a central question. My background is philosophy, even though I delve also into psychology and philosophy of education. And in philosophy, the kind of questions that we pose are usually questions of how should we think about a certain phenomenon that we are interested in. So kind of the guiding question for my talk today is how should we think of moral learning in early childhood education? There are those out there who think that moral learning doesn't really happen in early childhood education. And then really, strictly speaking, moral learning starts later on. So it's a genuine question of how should we think of moral learning in early childhood education? And there are two angles, specific angles that I want to look at in asking this question. One is the specific angle of the emotions, and the other one is of social interaction. So how should we think of the role of emotions in moral learning and of the role of social interaction in moral learning? And then if we put all of this together, really the question that I would like to explore is what is the relation between emotions and social interaction in the way we should think about moral learning in early childhood education. So the structure of my talk will be, I will begin by making a distinction between two different ways in which we can think about what moral learning is, and in particular about the outcomes of moral learning. I will start with the first one, the do's and don'ts, and just point out a couple of problems with a certain interpretation of it. And doing so will motivate a second way of thinking about it, which I will call moral learning as learning to value. And then I will, for the remainder of the talk, develop the second conception, first of all in part 2 by looking at emotional development, and then in part 3 by looking at social interaction, and in particular the role of conversations. And then in the final part, I will make some final remarks. Okay, so here's the distinction between two ways in which we can think about moral learning. On the one hand, we have something which we can call knowledge of do's and don'ts. And on the other hand, we have something we can call moral learning as learning to value. So in this section, I will focus mainly on knowledge of do's and don'ts, and then in the remainder of the talk on the second one. So what is knowledge of do's and don'ts? Well, one sort of very broad way of thinking about it, and what the outcome of this kind of moral learning is that we acquire a knowledge of obligations and duties that we have, where these take the form of do's and don'ts. And this knowledge comes in the form of principles or rules, if you like, which can be clearly specified and whose moral meaning is supposedly very clear. And then we sort of learn these principles and we apply them to certain situations. So examples can be knowing that one ought to help others in need, or for example, knowing that one ought not to lie, or that one ought not to steal. So stealing is wrong. And if that is sort of the outcome of moral learning, acquiring this kind of knowledge, when we then think about early childhood education, we might be tempted to think of moral learning as consisting in getting children to know what these do's and don'ts are and why they are important, in the form of knowing what these rules are and then teaching them how to apply them in different situations. And that's a very broad way of thinking about it, but just sort of as perhaps even just a straw man, but it's one way of thinking about it. And I just want to point out two problems with thinking about moral learning in these terms. The first one, which is quite the central problem, is that, in fact, there is something quite odd about thinking of moral learning in terms of knowledge of do's and don'ts in that sense there. So I ought not to steal, so on and so forth. And this is that what I think we want ultimately from our children is not merely that they have knowledge of what to do, of what one ought to do and what one ought not to do, and then assess them, so to speak, and they can pass the test if they can rehearse these kind of principles and rules. Rather, what we want from our children is that they come to value the activities involved in this. So take the example of something like the value of friendship, right? So one way of thinking about understanding the value of friendship is knowing that friendship is important and why, for example, right? But I think what we want from children, then developing into adolescents and adults, is not just the knowledge that friendship is important. What we want from them is that they value friendship. That is, they have friends and they understand the importance of giving support to friends and receiving support from friends. And the same goes for things like the value of kindness. And it seems to me, as I want to say a little bit more details throughout the talk, that merely conceiving of moral learning in terms of a knowledge that one acquires of do's and don'ts cannot help itself on its own to this other idea of a valuing, sort of adopting a valuing attitude towards things like friendship, kindness, and so on. And the second problem is that if we think of moral learning as knowledge of do's and don'ts, it becomes a little bit difficult to see moral learning as starting in early childhood. And first of all, it's because knowledge of do's and don'ts of the sort that can then be, if you like, rehearsed by someone when being tested, in fact, involves a certain amount of conceptual skills that are not necessarily acquired in the earliest stages of education. And that is, I suspect, the reason why, according to many people, moral learning, strictly speaking, doesn't really start in early childhood education. It starts later, say at 6 years onwards. And sure, the things that happens before is important for that later stage where we can properly talk about moral learning. But the early stages, strictly speaking, don't fall under the category of moral learning. And a related problem when we think about the emotional development of children is that if we think of moral learning as merely acquiring the knowledge of do's and don'ts, it's not very clear why emotional development or an understanding of emotions should have so much as a role in acquiring this knowledge. So by analogy, for example, one can learn rules and principles in mathematics, say, right, in a very theoretical way. There's no obvious place for an emotional development in the acquisition of rules and principles in mathematics. So if we start thinking of moral learning as merely the acquisition of certain rules and principles that one can then rehearse when being tested, if you like, then it also becomes obscure. Why is emotional development at all involved in it? Again, it might be a bit of a straw man, but I think that that kind of conception of moral learning does seep in sometimes, not only in philosophy and psychology, so in academic disciplines, but also in everyday thinking. So I was looking at the statutory framework for the Early Years Foundation stage published this year together with Catriona. And what we noticed is that, first of all, it's actually, so for those who don't know, but I'm sure everyone knows better than me, this is a framework that the government provides to teachers with a set of sort of guidelines on how to assess children on certain important aspects of children's life. And we were looking through it, and it's very difficult to understand how this framework understands what moral learning is in early years. Perhaps the place which gets closest to this is a section called Early Learning Goals, Personal, Social, and Emotional Development. And there we find a distinction, categorical distinction between two different areas of assessment. One is called self-regulation, which basically asks to show an understanding, children's understanding of their own feelings and those of others, and begin to regulate their behavior accordingly. And then we have a completely separate section of assessment, which is called managing self, which asks of children the ability to explain the reasons of rules, know right from wrong, and try to behave accordingly. And so if one asks, well, where is moral learning exactly here? We see a division between an understanding of the emotions and understanding of those rules, knowing right from wrong, for example. And so even in such a framework, it seems like if we think of moral learning as this acquisition of knowledge of right from wrong and the reasons for it, it's not clear how emotions come into it. I just thought that this was quite a good example of this kind of thing. So I think this can motivate a second way of thinking about moral learning as learning to value, which is what I'm going to spend the remaining of this talk talking about. So the second way of thinking about moral learning does not focus primarily on the acquisition of knowledge of what one should or should not do. Rather, it looks more at, as its outcome, the ability to engage with and respond to others in a way that expresses that valuing attitude that we really want in our children ultimately, over and above a mere knowledge of do and don't. And here I think there's a distinction that is really important, a distinction which I call learning about value and learning to value. So what is this distinction meant to be? Well, very broadly, learning about value, for example, is the kind of thing that happens when, say, we are reading a textbook of, say, an ancient society, which doesn't exist anymore, which had a certain value system. And as historians, we read a book about them and we learn about the values that they had at the time. But in no sense would we ever adopt those values ourselves. We would never develop valuing attitudes of that sort. And that's the kind of learning about value. So one can have a theoretical knowledge of those values, but in no sense would one adopt those values. Learning to value, on the other hand, is a learning which involves integrally adopting a valuing attitude towards something. So for example, this is the example I used before with the friendship case. So what we want from children, from our children, is not just that they have a theoretical knowledge of friendship and what friendship is and why it's important. What we want is the adoption of the value of friendship. That is, that they have friends and that they understand the need to give support to friends and receive support from friends, for example. And here a very important point is that the distinction is meant to track two different kinds of understanding of moral value. Precisely one that is theoretical and one that instead expresses a valuing attitude. And I think this is also meant to sort of shake a little bit an assumption that both philosophers and psychologists make, but I think also in everyday life we tend to make. And this is the assumption that if two people enunciate the same value judgment, for example, that's kind, and they may enunciate these judgments in the correct way, for example, they're able to pick an action that is actually kind, and they correctly say that is a kind action. Even though it's two people who enunciate the same judgment correctly, it still doesn't mean that they're expressing the same kind of understanding of value. It might be that one is expressing an understanding that has been acquired through a learning about the value, while someone else is expressing it through the learning to value. And so this distinction is sort of meant to focus a little bit more on the kind of understanding of moral value that I think we want ultimately in early childhood education, and of course onwards. It's sort of the kind of learning to value rather than just a learning about value. So in the remainder of this talk, I just want to say more about this learning to value and how it could fit into a notion of moral learning in early childhood education. And let me start with emotional development. And more specifically, I want to start by introducing a philosophical tradition, which some people say has been there since Aristotle, which hasn't always been dominant. In fact, I don't think it's dominant now either in places like moral philosophy or moral psychology and moral development research. And this is a tradition called sentimentalism, and its new form is called neo-sentimentalism. Anyways, these are just terminology. The key idea that it expresses, which is what we're interested in, is that there's a special connection between our emotions and our seeing moral value in certain situations. And so the key idea in this tradition is that the way we understand what is of moral importance in a given situation is closely connected to the way we understand what an appropriate emotional response would be towards that same situation. So the link here is a link in understanding. So we understand what is of moral value by understanding what emotional responses would be appropriate towards the given situation. So that's the core idea in sentimentalism, that our understanding of moral value is inextricably linked with our understanding of what makes a given emotional response appropriate. So let me give you two examples to sort of put some more substance in these really abstract ideas. So the first example goes as follows. Suppose that you see someone helping a person in need, crossing the street, and you think to yourself, what an admirable thing to do. So then the question is, how are you able to understand that the act is admirable? And what does it mean to have an understanding that an act is admirable? So the idea here would be that your understanding that the act you have witnessed is admirable is inextricably, intimately connected to your understanding that feeling admiration towards that act is an appropriate emotional response to have. And I think it's really important to stress the appropriate dimension. So our understanding of the given moral value, like admirability, for example, is closely connected to our understanding of the appropriateness of a given emotional response, say admiration. Here's another example. Suppose that you witness someone making an offensive joke this time to one of your colleagues or your peers or your friends, and you think or say that was really offensive. Again, how are we able to tell that the joke is offensive? What is the content of our understanding of the offensiveness of a joke? Again, here the idea is that our understanding of a joke as offensive is closely connected to our understanding that feeling, say, indignation towards that joke is the appropriate response to have. So that if someone were to ask, why do you think that feeling indignation at that joke is the appropriate emotional response to have, the kind of answer one gives is already an answer delving into the understanding of the value, of the moral value that the emotional response is a response to. So let's put some more substance on these abstract ideas. So what I think we can say by adopting this sentimentalist idea of the relation between emotions and our understanding of moral value is that what is of moral significance in certain situations, that we understand what is of moral significance in certain situations, happens by learning, again, what the appropriate emotional response is to have towards the given situation. Where this, again, we have admirability and the offensive gesture. But perhaps even more importantly, again, to put some more substance here, is by bringing this abstract idea into a developmental context, which is the context we are interested in today. And so what you get here is the idea that our children's emotional development, because of the close connection it has with between emotions and value, so the close connection between emotions and our understanding of moral value, it means that our emotional development is at the same time the development of our valuing of certain things. And that is, again, because furthering one's understanding of one's emotions and of the appropriateness of one's emotions is already a furthering of one's understanding of what is of value, because of the tight connection between emotions and value. And so the idea here would be that if we're looking for the locus, the place of the emergence of that learning to value, of that adopting, that valuing attitude, emotional development is the place to look at. Because, again, of this close connection between emotions and value. Of course, the idea would be that the emotional development is the development of appropriate emotions to have towards given situations. It's the development of an understanding of what emotional responses are appropriate to have towards given situations, which, again, at the same time is the acquisition of an understanding of the moral significance, of the moral value of certain situations, where this understanding is not merely a theoretical one, but it's the adoption of a valuing of the given things. For example, valuing friendship. So a little poll for a little sort of halfway break. Can you please, I'm really interested in knowing, in your experience, what are the most recurrent emotions that children feel and that is important for them to understand? Anger, yeah, so just like in the example. Frustration. We have out of controlness, belonging, disappointment, joy, rage, jealousy. Which one is the new one? Rage. It's really interesting. Sadness. Sadness was already maybe before. Envy. That's really interesting. So we have one joy, and then we have a lot of very intense emotions: annihilation, confusion, despair. Fantastic. Let's see if there's any new ones. So we have a lot of very intense and what some people would call negative emotions definitely take over the positive ones. Although I think positive negative distinction is a very cheap way and superficial of dividing them. These are all fundamental emotions that we need to, one needs to understand. Okay, thank you for that. So we looked at the connection between emotion and value, and how when we bring that into a moral development context, it can give us more robustness in this conception of what moral learning consists in early childhood education, where once again the outcome is not just a theoretical understanding of the value of something, but rather it's the adoption of a given attitude. And what I want to do now in the next section is to bring in social interaction, because emotional development is never really a merely individual thing. Emotional development is inextricably linked with social interaction. I don't think there's any kind of emotional development independently of social interaction. But why? What kind of social interaction are we talking about? And why should we think that? And in particular, how does that inform a little bit more a conception of moral learning in early childhood education? Well, in particular, I want to look at the role of conversations in the emotional development of children. And here, I want to focus, just sort of to keep grounded, on a set of studies that Robin Fivush, she is a professor of psychology at Emory University in the United States, who for years now has been looking at the way that children develop their ability to explain and narrate past events that they have lived through. And she and her team focused especially on studies between mothers and their children as young as 2.5 years old onwards, and in particular have been studying the conversations between mother and child about a past event that involved an emotional response of the child. Examples can be, for instance, when mother and child went to the park to play, for example, and there was an event there. For example, another child came to play with, might have taken the toy, the first child was upset. So things of this sort. So past events that have a certain personal meaning for the child, and which normally involve an emotional response. And what Fivush and her team were looking for is the connection between the emotion talk of the mother. So how is the mother using emotion talk, variety of emotion talk, so on and so forth, and how that's correlated with the child's developing use of emotion talk in constructing the narrative. So in constructing the meaning of what had happened in that past event. And just two preliminary conclusions they came up with, which might not be overly surprising, but they are incredibly interesting, is first of all that the studies show that the caretakers, mothers in this case, and children, in fact, spend loads of time talking about the events in the past and the meaning that those events have. But also they found with longitudinal studies that mothers that used more emotion talk at earlier stages of development of the child, and then the children, say a year later, they would be revisited by the psychologist, by Fivush and her team. And in narrating a past event, they would be using also a higher number of emotion words to describe the meaning of that past event. And perhaps that is not overly surprising. But one thing that I want to focus on, which I find fascinating about these studies, is that not only they were looking at how many emotion words were used by the mother in the conversations, but what they noticed is that parents can use very different conversational styles. And in particular, they made a distinction between two different conversational styles used by the parents with the child. One is they called an elaborative conversational style. And this is where the mothers would ask the question to the child. For example, do you remember what happened yesterday at the park? And then in this elaborative conversational style, the mothers would wait for the child to answer. And then they would prompt more answers from the child by asking the child further questions about the emotions that the child felt, but without sort of imposing a certain agenda or a certain view on it. And the mothers themselves used a variety, perhaps, of emotion words to have the conversation, but there's also a style to it. They were waiting for the child to answer, and they were providing a kind of scaffolding for the child to get a better understanding of the meaning of the past event by employing this emotion talk. Instead, another style they talked about was a repetitive, is what they call a repetitive conversational style. And here, the mothers, they repeated the same questions until either the child balked, so stopped answering altogether, or the child said what the parent wanted to hear. So here there was a secret, if you like, agenda, which unconsciously perhaps the parent was trying to push onto the child. And this they called it repetitive because the parents repeat the same question until they get the right answer. So why I think this is incredibly interesting, and sort of the proposal I want to put forward in this talk, is that these conversational styles, which happen, let's not forget, these are not single episodes. This is in a matter of years. This is a development in early childhood. These conversational styles are a form of moral learning in early childhood education. So as we've seen in the second part, in the connection between emotion and value, emotional understanding is intimately linked with understanding moral value. So an inquiry, if you like, into understanding a given emotion and its appropriateness is already an inquiry into our understanding the moral value towards which the emotional responses are response to. And the way in which a child learns how to talk about one's emotions then develops this kind of emotional self-understanding. So in this kind of conversations about one's emotions, what it involves at the same time is that learning the value of the given situation. And I think here, in order to see these conversational styles and the conversational moments as a form of moral learning, one also has to realize that there is a kind of process of generalization going on in these conversations. These conversations start with a particular specific personal event that the child experienced, perhaps with the mother. And then in jointly reminiscing about it through these conversations, they get an understanding of the emotion they felt at the time, which helps them develop an understanding of the meaning of what happened, right? But more than this, what is happening at the same time is that the child is not only learning, say, what I felt in that moment and what it meant only for me to feel, but in development, what one finds is that the child is learning about the emotion itself. So what does it mean to feel anger at something? And what does it mean to feel sadness at something? And these are forms of generalization to the point that then it's not just about sadness means only this, only to me, but this is what sadness in general means. And so when someone is sad, this is why they are sad. And so by involving this kind of generalizing process in these conversations, what is happening is that the children are already learning the kind of moral meaning that given emotions are, in their appropriate cases, responses to. Okay, so that was sort of my general proposal, and very quickly, I want to end with two remarks. The first one is that there is a tendency, both in research but also in everyday life, to think that the personal and the moral are categorically distinct categories. So the personal, we think of it as subjective preferences, idiosyncratic attachments, partiality, while morality is supposed to be impartiality, universalizability, and things like that. In fact, what I think we see, if we think of moral learning as emerging from this kind of understanding of emotions, and especially understanding of emotions from understanding the particular past personal events in children's development, is that our moral learning emerges from an understanding that originally is personal. That is something that yesterday in the park happened to the child, right? It doesn't start with generality. It starts with happened to me, and that's important to me. And we go from there to moral learning. And so in fact, these two are not distinct categories at all. They are importantly connected. And yeah, so think of moral learning as involving a coming to value, which is sort of the initial thought, where emotional development and social interaction are central. I think involves rethinking the distinction between the personal and the moral. And final thought is, what is the aim of moral education? Usually moral developmentalists always say that the aim is the prediction of pro-social behavior. We need to predict that our children will become democratic citizens. We need to predict that they will become kind people. That might be a reasonable thing to think about. But I think there's another element which we often don't think about when we think about morality and moral learning, and that is well-being. I think that if we look at moral learning in this kind of emerging from this personal beginning, when children enjoy a healthy emotional development in which they understand their emotional responses and emotional responses in general, they value things like friendship and helping others. And they are able to enter social interactions of reciprocity and mutual recognition, which all of this constitutes well-being, but it also constitutes a moral learning. And so I think there's a case to be made that in early childhood education, moral development is closely connected to well-being, to the well-being of children. And I think that was all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I don't know if other people can hear, maybe not, hopefully not. You've just cued me in at the time when the bell is ringing in Bristol. So I do hope that's not a distraction. It will stop very shortly. So over to me. I'd like to thank Nikki for chairing the first half of today's session. And I'd also like to thank very much indeed Katrina and Daniel for their insightful and thought-provoking comments. We're going to turn next the opportunity to pose questions and to reflect and further discuss some of the issues that these presentations have raised, remembering that Alex will be taking your questions as an experienced early childhood educator more generally. We can't ask him to answer more specific questions that you might have wanted to put to Katrina had she been able to join us this afternoon live. Daniel, of course, is here live, and I think posing questions to him is completely fair game. But I think they'll both be up to the challenge. I've got a few questions on Slido. A couple of them are mine, because I was really fascinated by this discussion. But hopefully, as we go through, there will be some other ones as well. I've got a popular question. Well, I've got a very popular comment from Joe Albin Clark, who's in the audience, who just says early childhood is such a rich place for thinking with and about morals. I think both of our presentations this afternoon have definitely confirmed that. So I think we're with you on that, Joe. Thank you for that. A question perhaps for both of you. Let's go back to the more practical. So we started with the practical, and then Daniel's done this excellent exposition of a more theoretical framework. In practice, Alex, you might like to comment on this as well. How do you think schools might make use of this idea of conversations for emotional development in practice? Did you want to start, Daniel, and then maybe Alex come in after that?
I think Alex, okay. I mean, I think also if Alex, if you want to go first.
Yeah, that's fine, Daniel. You've done a fantastic bit of exposition there. So yeah, I can take that question. And thank you so much for the talks today as well. They're really thought-provoking, and for your questions too. In terms of my experience of how we can promote this idea of conversation, I think it's mainly through shared experience from my own personal background in practice. It's through undergoing those shared experiences in which we have those opportunities to start and engage in those conversations through co-reflection with children. So we can start to, for example, experience the elements if we're out, for example, in an outdoor environment, such as going out for a nature walk or something like that. We have various things to contend with, which can actually create emotional affective responses in us, which are kind of neutrally from the environment itself, and therefore they're not so preloaded with kind of interpersonal problems, which can be harder to resolve. To illustrate this as an example, I remember once in practice, I was really struggling with, it was actually a 10-year-old boy who was from the after school group and a 4-year-old, and they really were not getting on at all. They were fighting and they just couldn't see eye to eye. They couldn't sort of give any sort of understanding of each other's cognitive affective states, if you like, if you want to use some of Daniel's ideas there. So I was just sort of, in a way, pulling my hair out a bit, thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Got out, still got like 4 hours together. So actually we went out and we did a geocache walk, which is where you go hunting for like treasure chests out in the environment. And we went walking up, it was up St. Boniface Down on the Isle of Wight. And it was really windy. And I just remember being struck by the contrast between being in the setting where the conversations were very almost verging on aggression sometimes, to then going out of the setting and having these things to contend with, such as the wind, and the ground was very hilly like that. And I just remember turning around and seeing this 10-year-old supporting this 4-year-old and helping support them down the hill, and really understanding that you know, their subjective experiences. So you had this kind of intersubjective process that was brought about through an environmental challenge, which they wouldn't have had in a setting. And I think essentially they were probably a little bit bored. they were kind of taken out on each other and not seeing eye to eye. So the conversations that unfolded from that were actually able to they were able to better reflect on their affective states from before, when they were in the setting, because they were in a space now which was so dissonant and different from what they'd experienced in the setting, that it enabled that reflective capacity. Now, in that 10-year-old, that reflective capacity was a little bit different to what it was in the 4-year-old, of course, because of their cognitive stage and their emotional literacy. But it certainly did open up the opportunity for some just agreeing on universal things about kindness, about, you know, giving back to each other, and about realizing each other's states of well-being. And through me being able to positively affirm that, oh, that was lovely of you when you helped him down the hill today. It was much better than me constantly firefighting and saying, as Daniel said earlier, the do's and don'ts. And I think it's through those, for me anyway, the conversations that are through enriched experiences are the ones where you manage to develop that insightful and more in-depth conversation. As Daniel pointed out, the difference between repetition, which I sometimes would call firefighting in practice, where practitioners are saying yes, no, or quite often it's no as well, you know, don't do that, don't do this. And kind of recognizing the universality of those principles. And then, of course, in the same time, through those shared experiences, they were able to experience that sense of awe and wonder as well, which was a point that actually resonated when you were talking there. I was thinking about philosophy for childhood, and, you know, Ofsted and DFE acknowledged this term awe and wonder of the world, and to experience that together is in that shared experience. And to me, that promotes those more insightful, in-depth, co-constructed conversations, which can help us to better understand the link between our cognitive appraisal of our affective responses emotionally. So I'm trying to use Daniel's theory there a little bit in practice, but hopefully that some way answers that question through experience.
Can I add a thing? So first of all, I fully agree with Alex. The sharedness of it is, I think, is key. And that's what the notion of a conversation, I think, why the notion of a conversation and just the conversation, why it's so special, because there's a moment of sharedness happening there, right? And I think that sort of my hunch is that that moment of generalization that I was talking about, where the understanding one acquires is not just, I'm the one experiencing this emotion and this is what it means for me, but rather this is what it is to experience an emotion and this is what the emotion means. And so anyone else who will feel that emotion might also understand certain given situations in the same way. The reason why that kind of generalization happens in a conversational context is not coincidence. It's because I think that that moment of sharedness in a conversation, being with someone else, precisely involves making that emotion I felt and what I think about the situation public, if you like, in a certain moment. And once you make it public, it's public. It's already generalizing in a way. It's not just you anymore. And so I 100% agree with Alex about the sharedness. And the other thing I wanted to say, when I was listening to Katrina's talk, and she was talking about the golden rules that they use, right? The do's and the knowledge of do's and don'ts that I was speaking of, the way I was thinking of it is definitely not in the way that Katrina uses the golden rules. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding of what I said. In no way does it sort of, is it a kind of potential criticism of what Katrina does in school? Not at all. In fact, quite the opposite, because when I was looking at the titles of the books and the titles of the golden rules they were using, it was things like, we are gentle, we are kind, we listen, right? This is not, you have to listen, you have to be kind. And already that phraseology is quite different, because it's not anymore, these are the principles that you have to do or not do, but it's we listen, we are kind. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And just the way those golden rules were sort of articulated, already invited in a way as this kind of sharedness bit, which I think is absolutely key in the moral learning.
We've got a comment here from Joe saying, thank you, Alex, for drawing attention to the non-verbal and how real life experiences are important points of entry. If I may just jump in here, I've got a great question from Alison, but I want to come back to you both on this idea of shared experience, because as a fellow philosopher, obviously the idea of shared experience is a problematic one that philosophers have drawn attention to. I'm thinking here, for example, of cultural diversity and how things are experienced and how the human is framed, perhaps from one cultural context to another. And to give, by way of an example, when I was doing some work in South Africa and talking about ethics, albeit with much older people, somebody from a Xhosa background said, yeah, we don't really have the word ethic. What do you mean by ethic? What do you mean by moral? What do you mean by value? And this idea, whether in fact we're talking about universal, generalizable human experiences. I know it's important, Daniel, to your account, so you might want to clarify how you sort of square that circle. And Alex, I don't know if you've got a comment to make, again, rooting it back into experience. I
have to say that I think cultural diversity is one of it's kind of the philosopher's Achilles heel. I think that as philosophers, we are always trained to think in such high abstract levels that we very often don't start the inquiry. So for us, cultural diversity becomes a potential thought-provoking counterexample rather than the starting place to think about a given concept, right? First of all, I'm incredibly fascinated by, I would be incredibly fascinated to read more about a culture that doesn't have a word for, obviously that they might not have the word for ethics or moral, but I would like to know how other cultures understand, I guess, normative guidance of, Socrates talked about how we ought to live, right? again, that might be a question that can arise only within certain cultures and not others. But I guess here I'm also a bit, maybe this is the philosopher's part that doesn't want to concede too much. I mean, of course, there is cultural diversity, and it's incredibly important. And I guess it's the fear of the philosopher here of, our house of cards, abstract house of cards falling. But I guess I'm a bit of an optimist in thinking that if we're going to think about ethics and morality in that sort of, these are the rules, this is this and so, we're going to have a harder time maybe trying to find a shared notion of what one could mean by morality. But I cannot help but think that emotions are such a core part of what it is to be a human being that, and I'm trying to understand what an emotion is, which undoubtedly will change between cultures. So what is the value that responds to a certain emotion? And the more fine-grained the emotions become, the more diversity we're going to find. But I can't help but think that at the very least for a set of emotions, it's just so defining of what it is to be a human being that if anywhere we're going to look for a shared experience in cultural diversity, it will be a certain set of emotions. But, this may be controversial, but I can't, that's my hunch. But again, I think we should be paying, as philosophers, much more attention to cultural diversity.
So thank you, Daniel. That's really insightful. But the only thing I would add to that, and I'm sorry if I jump into the theoretical a little bit here, but I think there's a danger of kind of looking at language and thought accepting too much of a sort of hard line on a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis here of thinking that, it could just be a semantic thing between the languages there, because, I do think it's difficult for us to conceptualize even of a culture which doesn't accept adaptivity. And perhaps this notion of adaptivity and adapting to our environments collectively is what's fundamentally true for all of us. I'm just thinking from an evolutionary perspective, if we don't eat, we die. And so, and therefore to share food with others means survival. So you have this kind of socially informed eudaimonia, or like giving back to each other in order to fundamentally survive. And that is a key fundamental characteristic of us as an organism that is true across all cultures. And so I would guess that there was some sort of translation of ethic between all cultures, but that perhaps semantically it's different, and we must look at a weak Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and think about how linguistically we might reframe it. But always, and it's really interesting when you have children from various different cultures, how we must be so universal in our approach in order to accept both the secular and the non-secular groups of society, as was alluded to earlier. And it's like finding that way is really, really hard in practice. And it's only through really in-depth reflection, insight, and moral questioning and so on of the practitioner that they can arrive at a way of being or an ontology which is inclusive of everyone. But it's a real struggle. And I always find myself treading on eggshells and worrying that I'm going to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, or upset somebody culturally or racially because I have a certain way of thinking, way of being. But equally, I personally, so in terms of like Gramsci and cultural hegemony and all of those kinds of arguments that there's no such thing as common sense and so on, I find them really interesting. But also I would say that there is a line in which actually there is a kind of commonality between us as a species, but I know that others might argue against that, of course, and that's fine. I just think that there are certain universal principles. And I think that, from a Rousseauian perspective, they do grow from childhood. And so perhaps we as adults need to in some way co-reflect with young children. And Daniel mentioned earlier about young children not, being able to understand morality. And obviously we need to couple that with cognitive development and Kohlberg's theories and so on. But I would actually argue that morality begins from a very early age, and it's through those ways of being and that shared, use this theme of shared experience. It's the practitioner or the mother or the primary attachment figure and their relationship together with the outer world that informs that sense of shared morality. And it's, again, coming back to those experiences again, and which promote those kinds of conversations where we can develop depth and insight into each other and therefore ourselves, and be sort of what I would call like clean mirrors for each other, but, so that we're not scared of reflecting back and being reflected back in the other. I think when the danger happens, it's when we have like what I would call dirty mirrors, where we're worried about toxification between two people. So we think that what's being reflected back is actually not an accurate representation. You know, it hurts not to be understood. And I think that is a fundamental feature of human existence as well, that we don't like not being understood. I would argue that, I would guess hypothetically that that was true of all cultures, that it's not very nice not to be understood. And therefore communication and open honesty would be key characteristics of effective ethical practice. And then that draws it back to attachment theory and Bowlby and so on. But I just think having that way of being, of true acceptance and open honesty, creates transparency, creates that kind of creative flow in the other, so that children can freely express themselves artistically and otherwise. You know, the 100 languages of children, as Malaguzzi puts it, but, you know, in being able to express oneself openly, as Daniel said, to have everything out in the open, I think is really key. And it's through perhaps those shared experiences that we can get that. But if we just kind of stay in the setting all the time and stay in one room and do the same thing every day, we're not going to have those kind of collective experiences that are enriching on a moral level. So that would be my response to that.
Fascinating responses from you both, and I could come back, but everyone will be relieved to know I'm not going to. Gemma has suggested this really thoughtful response to both of you. Perhaps we could at least feel confident about Ekman's 6 universal emotions across cultures. So there's an interesting idea. Thank you very much for that, Gemma. What I'd like to do, I mentioned a while back that Alison had got a question, Alison Roberts, so I think I'd like to move on, if that's okay, to Alison's question, which is this. Do you think if children and young people's emotional vocabulary becomes more nuanced, it is a measure of their emotional literacy? So I guess, I mean, that makes me, I don't know if this is where your question's coming from, Alison, but I was thinking about what Katrina was saying about introducing new language and enriching the language of the children in her class from what they'd noticed had been quite restricted. So do you think if the emotional vocabulary becomes more nuanced, it is a measure of their emotional literacy? Thank you, Alison.
Would you like to go first, Alex? I think, I guess a lot depends on what emotional literacy is. But I guess one thing that I would like to say is that just learning words, of course, is not the end goal here. The end goal is the ability to use the right words to describe how one is feeling and what it means to feel that given emotion. And I think it's something Katrina said, which was absolutely essential, which she mentioned, is that very often adults, so the conversational interlocutor of the child, will use the wrong word to express what they're feeling. So for example, they're going to say sad instead of cross, right? And that is something that the child picks up on, Katrina was saying, as far as I understood Katrina. And they're going to be able sort of to understand that it's not the right word. But what can also happen is that they will pick up that way of speaking about a given emotion, which is not right. It's not the right word. But the problem here is not just that it's not the right word that is being used, but that the meaning of what one is feeling and the meaning of what one has experienced is not being understood. I think that's ultimately the problem. So more emotion words, as Katrina was saying, they're noticing children with using less emotion words. I agree with Katrina, that is a problem, and it's absolutely amazing the work they're doing by introducing more emotion words. But what I take also Katrina to have said in that moment is not just the introduction of words, so words that they can repeat. The idea is that they use more words, but together with that they say how they feel. That is sort of the moment. And I guess learning more emotion words and saying how you feel and putting the right word to how you feel are they integrate as processes. But it's not, I guess, just learning the emotion words, but they are there to tell someone else how they feel and learn what it means to feel like that. Where again, in my sort of view of things, learning how I feel and what it means to feel like this is already learning about what I'm responding to out there. So emotions are not just tickles, they're responding to meaningful events out there. And that is what is happening when a child, I think, is learning about their own emotions. So I think, yeah, that's sort of how I would take the question.
Thanks, Daniel. I think for me, it conjures, I just started thinking of the book Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, where these monsters appear and the monsters have no name, and Max kind of, you know, is the king of that land, and he can't understand these creatures and what they are, and actually they are, you know, I read it as Sendak's, meaning they're the child's unconscious emotional forces who he's playing with on this fictional island, and he gradually becomes, you know, he masters those feelings, but they don't really have a name as such. They're just these kind of monsters. And so to me, you know, it's important to enrich children's emotional vocabulary, but to do so only when we can parallel it very clearly with the correct emotional affective response, so that they make that link. I think there is a danger of distortion. You know, we can give all the emotional vocabulary in the world, but, you know, that wouldn't really mean much if there was no authenticity and self-connection. So it's about encouraging that connectivity to self to better articulate oneself. And I think this is where creativity is so key in early childhood, because if we can encourage spaces, psychologically safe spaces, where children feel happy to create and to express themselves just for the sake of that creation itself, and not to feel structurally bound up to have to create in a specific way. You know, when they're drawing, we don't necessarily say, oh, well, that looks like a nice house, or that looks like a nice tree or a nice person. We just say, you know, tell me a little bit about this. So it's very inductive, that approach. And it's therefore not projecting our own value systems on what they're expressing. And through that, we're then not creating fear responses in children when we're risking of incorrectly guessing their subjective worldviews. So just through allowing and enabling that creativity and that articulation, you know, things like spoken word and freedom of expression and singing and dancing and coming up with gibberish words and poems and, you know, just using language creatively is a wonderful way, I think, of connecting us linguistically with our inner worlds. You know, how often are you speaking and you're not really thinking about what you're saying? It's just like automatic. And I think that automatic speech is really important. So is automatic drawing, automatic writing, and so on. It's that flow from the unconscious outward. But that's quite scary, because to reveal oneself to the world is we're inhibited naturally often, and different cultures are more inhibited than others. I'm British, so, you know, I'm stereotypically very inhibited, but I think we need to create spaces where we can break away from those inhibitions, where we don't feel judged. That's why I went into early years, actually. Originally, was because early childhood, because I like working with children, because they don't, sounds really strange, but they don't judge me, and I sense that in people. I like being with people where I don't feel judged. That makes me feel happier, I've realized. So that's what drew me to the profession in the first place, actually. But I think it's really key that we keep that atmosphere, and we as practitioners celebrate that openness, that creativity as well. So I think that's how I would respond to that. Emotional literacy is really important, but we must make sure that we have that creativity and that open honesty with each other as well.
Can I answer, Alex, very quickly, because it was such a fascinating point. Just this way of sort of, this connects also to one of the comments, Janet, you read out about the non-verbal, right? So just sort of teaching children, not children, in fact, everyone, but with children, teaching children this, it's okay to express how you feel. Even just that moment there, right? And yes, then we bring in emotion words to be able to structure the meaning of things. But just that thing of it's okay to express it, I think you're already 50% of the way in acquiring an understanding of what is going on internally, so your emotions, and what is going on externally. So what are your emotions responding to, right? So I was just wondering with Alex, so you mentioned drawing, for example. Are there other things in school with children and one can do to sort of develop, right, this kind of, it's okay to express, you know, bring it out in the shared, in the open?
So yeah, I think, you know, to give other examples of that expression, if that's what you're asking, Daniel, like we use, so a good example of that is like functional fixity in psychology, which I'm sure you may have come across the concept where you know, this pen is just a pen and it writes, and as an adult I use it as a pen and only a pen. In early childhood, we can use this as all sorts of different things. It could have 1,000 different uses. So, for example, when we're looking at the environment, the play environment, we'd prefer to give children a cardboard box, which costs nothing, and often we get for free, rather than a kind of toy car, because actually there's 1,000 different uses for that cardboard box, and they've got to use that flexibility of thought to actually create themselves. So we're encouraging and nurturing creativity all the time, rather than giving them toys and apparatus which has a fixed way of working. So encouraging that ability to think divergently and not to lose that divergent thinking is really, really important. So it might be of interest to you in your background with philosophy to think about that pedagogically in terms of how we promote that creative opportunity through those play experiences, and it not through kind of predetermined uses of plastic toys and so on, but actually open-ended play, loose parts play, and those kinds of things. And from a Froebelian perspective, they're playing with different forms of life, forms of beauty, forms of knowledge, but through the articulation of various different apparatus. So I like Froebel's kind of way of thinking about the world in that way. And I think that, unfortunately, we kind of tend to lose that as they move up into the older ages and we become more assessment driven. And as adults, then we become very functionally fixed and we can't think as divergently as children can. So part of our role as early years practitioners at early childhood is to keep that divergent thought and creativity. And I think there's more of a demand from government now as well. Governments throughout the world are realizing the power of creativity because, artificial intelligence and so on are going to probably take over in lots of different domains where we were once masters of that. I think that computers are going to quickly take over there. So creative thought and innovation and divergence is key, I think, not only for emotional thing that we're talking about here, but broader socioeconomically as well. We're probably moving towards trajectories in that kind of way, I'd hope anyway.
Alison is very grateful for your comments. So thank you for that, Alison. And Joe's got another point, but I'm just going to sneak in because I actually had another question, which I think fits in quite well here. So I'm really interested in what you've been saying, Alex, about creativity and that sense of openness. And that seems to fit in with what Daniel is saying about moral development as not about do's and don'ts and being prescriptive. I'm quite interested then in how, when you're getting children to express their feelings linked to values, whether you put any boundaries around that. And I'm saying this without wishing to embarrass myself too much. I can clearly remember an incident as a very small child when I was very, very annoyed indeed. And I did something extremely spiteful that was really horrible to everybody else. And I did it when I was about 3 or 4. I'm still ashamed now. Are there any kind of boundaries or ways in which these conversations about emotions can kind of regulate behavior a bit? I feel like you're being a bit too free and easy, and that there maybe should be some boundaries, and I want to hear about those.
Yeah, so Janet, do you mean boundaries as in allowing children, if there's always a line, isn't there? Where if you allow too much creativity and that kind of openness, you might end up leading to echo chambers of kind of unwanted behaviors or things which aren't necessarily helpful, but also intruding too much perhaps on the, do you mean I just did
something I shouldn't have done? I mean, I was very angry with everybody else. So my mum had prepared this bottle of drink for everybody to share. And it was like, no, we're not going to share this. And I literally ran around the garden emptying it out so that nobody got any of that drink. It was really a terribly naughty thing to do, very spiteful. And I got into lots of trouble, quite rightly, in my view.
Yeah, I think in terms of those boundaries, I think children need those boundaries. And I think I've seen practice where historically, when Rousseau released his book, Emile, parents and families apparently went too far into the passive route of that. And I wouldn't like to promote that at all. I totally believe in a kind of authoritative spaces where children understand that there are limits to what they can and can't do. So we try to keep in for example, forest school practice or therapeutic play, we keep those boundaries very reduced and very limited, and also in early childhood as well, because we want them to be able to fully introject those boundaries so that they understand them. But they are like, we keep each other safe, like the golden rules, like Jenny Moseley says, keep each other safe. We are gentle, we are all of those different things. And I think, you know, there has to be those boundaries. And what's lovely is when I hear children say to an adult, you know, you said we would do this, and now you've said that we shouldn't do that. And they hold the adult to account often in withholding those boundaries. And so for you, Janet, when you were running around outside and being reckless, you knew probably full well that you were being a bit unruly. And that self-regulation probably comes from realizing that, you know, universally we're accepting these ground rules because they are universally, you know, for us in our setting, and the golden rules are great at that, and you've got golden time associated with that as well, and so on. But yeah, I think definitely if you don't have any boundaries at all, it could easily fall that way, as Baumarin shows us, between authoritative and passive parenting, and same is equivalent in behavior policies. We'd end up with very chaotic environments. So I think there is definitely, you know, a limit to the amount of kind of free flow creativity there. There's a wonderful book as well, all about, I think it's called like Dark Play or something like that, which is all about children's, you know, when free flow play moves into that kind of domain of bullying and even racism and echo chambers are very unhelpful things. So we as practitioners must be fully aware of that. And I was hearing about a setting up in Sheffield recently where they allow children just to work everything out themselves, and the practitioners take a very sort of distant approach. But obviously there's a line where they have to step in to prevent anyone getting seriously hurt emotionally or physically. So yeah, I definitely think those boundaries are super important, and I think that's very well worth clarifying. You know, we can't just go for a full-on creative flow methodology, because you'll end up with children probably hurting each other.
Daniel, before you pop in, there's a nice comment here from Zoe on this point, who says we need to foster wisdom alongside creativity so that children are sensitive to the likely impact of their creations on others. Daniel.
Yeah, so especially one bit that Alex mentioned that I think is very important is this self-regulation, right? Which is funny enough also rightly so in the statutory framework it's mentioned. I think that sort of the two things that can help with the boundaries is, first of all, that the kind of understanding that I think we want from children is precisely on this appropriate, right? And the words appropriate can sound a bit Victorian, perhaps, but they don't need to. The idea here would be that the close link that there is between our emotional responses and what our emotional responses are responses to, so that the moral value of things, it's a link between appropriate emotions and the moral value, not inappropriate. So, for example, you know, very, very simple example, I think, and many think, that appropriate anger, so that anger can be appropriate, for example, towards an offensive joke, right? The problem becomes when anger is inappropriate. So inappropriate in the sense of not that it's not following social convention, which is the Victorian sense of inappropriate. Inappropriate in the sense that it's not responding to what it's meant to be responding in a certain way. So it's misfiring in a certain sense. So the kind of understanding that I think we want to develop in children, or from an early age, to everyone from an early age, I should say, is an understanding of the appropriate emotions. So what is the emotion actually meant to be responding to? And of course here, you know, there's a lot of ground here to then start saying, well, who decides what they're meant to, you know, who decides what they're meant to be responding? I think we can, within a society, kind of agree when an emotional response is appropriate or not, and have a dialogue about it. And I think together with that kind of understanding of the appropriateness of the emotion comes the self-regulation that Alex was talking about. I think that a powerful concept in psychology is emotion regulation. Someone who is able, because of the understanding one has of the meaning of emotions and the appropriate, inappropriate, in the sense of when it's misfiring, when it's not misfiring.
Can I just chip in, Daniel, because there's a nice point that's getting a lot of attraction in the chat. So Harriet has pointed out Montessori suggests freedom's limit, or openness, they prefer to say. Freedom's limit is the interest of the community plus limits of the good, so respect for self, others, and environment. What would you say to that suggestion?
I mean, yeah, that sounds like a lot of good core moral values. So for example, what are, say, concrete examples where those moral values come up? So Alex, I think you were talking about some environmental things earlier on, and sorry, I'm getting confused. It's Alex or Katrina was talking about teaching children about certain environmental things like pollution and stuff like that. So those are concrete examples where the kind of moral values you've just, kind of values that you've just mentioned come in. So why are they important? And I think that's, and also, again, what we want is that all of us from early stages, we don't just develop an understanding. So for example, I think a lot of people's understanding of climate change and what's causing climate change and why things like pollution are bad is a very kind of learning about value stuff. It's a very theoretical understanding. I can tell you exactly a bit of science, a bit of morality, and here's the package. But what is my attitude really showing here? Now, how deep is that understanding of value going? I don't think very deep. So what we want is that deeper kind of valuing from the children. And I think that especially from early ages, if you bring in an understanding of why a certain given emotion is appropriate to have towards things like pictures of fish, you know, in the middle of plastic, why one can be upset at such an image, which can be very strong, and why that is the appropriate emotion to have. Not being scared of feeling upset at seeing even an animal drowning in plastic, and understanding that that is the appropriate way of feeling about it, I think will give you that valuing bit, that extra valuing bit. Yeah, so I don't know. This doesn't relate anymore to the emotional regulation part of before, but this is what I would answer to that.
Yeah, that's fine. I've got two other comments, and then I think we've got another poll that we'd like to do. And Joe, I haven't forgotten your question, or you have another interesting point I think to raise about language, but we'll do that after in about 5 minutes, I think, or maybe a little bit less. So Joe, going back to the point about play, Jo has said that she likes Brian Sutton Smith's work for thinking about all the nuances of play. Alex, maybe that's something that you're familiar with. I don't know, might like to comment in a minute. And Kate, going back to the regulation and boundaries point. So thank you, Daniel, for sort of getting us back to there. But Kate asks, do boundaries lie in Bakhtin's point? The world is half ours and half the world's. E.g., in using sad, we give it meaning and are held by what others take it to mean. So is Bakhtin helpful here? That's a sort of philosophical point and a more pedagogic point. Any thoughts about Brian Sutton Smith's work? I apologise, Joe, it's not something I'm familiar with. So if I'm not explaining it very well in a sort of cack-handed way, that's why I don't own the question. It'd be much better if it came from you, but I'm doing my best.
So I'll give you a lovely example of from practice of a child using a Montessori tower. So a Montessori tower is a piece of apparatus designed by, obviously, Maria Montessori to encourage children's mathematical thinking and geometry, and it's very precisely made, and the big one goes at the bottom, and then it works up to smaller and smaller, and it has one way of working so a child can self-correct if they kind of get that wrong. But one might argue that in that way, and obviously Montessori is trying to support children's, you know, basic needs and so on, mathematical skills here. But one might argue that it's structurally kind of bound to be fixed to use in that way. Whereas someone like Sutton Smith might say that those kind of culturally enforced hegemonic forces which dictate how we play with something will lead to adults who become overly passive in their institutions or in their structural societies, and with that passivity breeds control, you know, state control and so on. So we must make sure that we promote that creative form of play. And I remember in my practice once coming in and seeing the most amazing thing, that the child had put the Montessori tower upside down with the tiniest block. Well, I think that was actually the second to tiniest block, because the tiny one is tiny, and we have to hide it because children choke on it. But they put it on the floor, and they managed to balance this thing upside down. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because it's such an amazing feat of engineering. It was just way beyond me. But if we were to just enforce those hegemonic forms of play, which I believe Sutton Smith kind of challenges in ways, then we might end up being echo chambers for very fixed ways of thinking. So it's great to encourage that flexibility of thought and that freedom, But as Montessori points out, within those boundaries, because if we start negatively impacting upon others, that's where a line needs to be drawn, of course. So creativity with those clear eudaimonic boundaries, so that we're not hurting ourselves or others, is really, really fundamental there. So I'd say, you know, I'm always up for practitioners being very bold and creative in how they use the resources with children, but equally, when if I'm using a piece of Montessori apparatus, I'll show the child how to use it in the effective way, the proper way, so to speak, but also allow them certain freedoms and creativity as Froebel would have allowed in his approach. And I do, it's a good way of seeing it, looking at Froebelian practice versus Montessori practice in that kind of way, because Froebel to begin with could be seen as quite prescriptive in how the gifts were used, for example, but then actually, as Froebel developed in his thinking, he actually became more loose with how it could potentially be used and really promoted that idea of creativity. But I think, certainly when we're focusing back on morality and ethics, I think through the vehicle of play, that is where we can explore all sorts of kinds of facets of our human existence and our coexistence with each other, to self-regulate collectively through shared play experiences. Because then we develop a universality of understanding, because we can't micromanage our whole of our existences through the do's and don'ts, of course. That's ridiculous if you think about it. So we must have practices through play and those kind of shared experiences that encourage us to think in those sort of nuanced ways and to be able to cope with whatever the world throws at us through creative solutions focused approaches.
So the person who was already very happy that you talked about Froebel is going to be even more happy, Alex, after that last answer. Daniel, did you want to say anything at this point about Bakhtin? You're muted.
No, because I don't really know I know of Bakhtin, but I'm afraid my expertise doesn't extend to that.
That's one to go away and think about, maybe.
Yeah.
We're going to do a short exercise now. I've got one question in reserve. We're going to do a poll, and we'd love to know whether this is hitting the spot in terms of your current work, whether that's as an academic researcher, practitioner, or whatever else it is you do that's brought you here to this event today. So is the conversation relevant to your current work? And if it is, if you could answer yes or no. And if it is, obviously if it's no, we're very sorry, but these things happen. If it's yes, we'd love to know why it's relevant. If you could fill in just a few words so that we can get a sense of where we're going with this. So is this conversation relevant to your current work? Yes or no?
It's like a suspense moment.
Hooray! Woo! That's made us all very happy. Excellent. And then I think, Matt, if we can go on to the next one. So how?
That's really inspiring, isn't it? That people who work with older children have taken something from this as well, because I think there's so much that we do in early childhood that is relevant throughout all ages of pedagogy.
Alex, I would say I don't even work with children. I work with adults and at doctoral level, and I can hear lots of resonances between the kind of work that I do, conversations I have with teachers. Obviously, it plays out very differently, but all sorts of resonances making me think about a lot. Yeah. Other people are interested in religious education, people that are working in early years, emotional vocabularies and storytelling. I've got a value there like compassion picked out in one. I mean, we're not going to do justice to all of these now, but we were really keen just to get a sense from you while you were here about where if it was resonating, how and why. So we shall pore over those answers with great interest after the event. And thank you very, very much for sharing those with us. Thank you, Meta. I think we've got that. Yeah, we're doing questions. I think it was a sort of more of an observation than a question, but I think it's a really interesting observation. I'd like to share it with both of you. It's one from Joe, who has commented on how there's a lot of focus on spoken language at the moment, rather than perhaps languages in a broader sense. Any reflection on that? How important is spoken language? What about other languages and the emotions?
Alex,
I mean, sorry, shall I start, Daniel? Yeah, okay. I mean, to me, body language is, equally as important, if not even more, and often it's that leakage. So I love the term of, like, in terms of body language, we can talk about lower leakage, which always sounds a bit dubious. But there's a kind of the way that the body reveals what we're actually thinking, and the dissonance between what we're saying and how we're gesticulating, as I'm trying to do with my hands here, is really, really key. And, so there's body language, but also the language of play as well. That's why play therapy and those sorts of therapeutic approaches are so effective, because they're communicating in ways that are beyond language. And I think, I know that they contain words, but songs and singing and the actual harmonies within music resonate with us. So the emotional affect of different chords, for instance, is really fascinating, and where that comes from, in terms of, all sorts of different theories around why music creates those emotional affective responses is really interesting. And I think certainly the power of music shouldn't be underestimated, neither should the power of art and drawing and painting. And I'm sure Bakhtin, as was mentioned a moment ago, would really be supportive of those creative modalities, so that we're not just communicating linguistically, which can at worst be quite structurally bound up and quite at worst patriarchal and androcentric and male-centered. So it's nice not to propagate those things by using other forms of creativity that can be not anti-establishment for the sake of being anti-establishment, but because we have to have those creative forms and ways of thinking, so that we, once again, not being wrapped up and bound up in semantic structures that are forced upon us. So yeah, viva creativity, it's important, but also with sufficient moral boundary, and the mindfulness of the cognitive stages too is really helpful. I know it's not really connected here, but I think it's really important that practitioners have that knowledge, so that they know that a child isn't necessarily lying to them on purpose. They're fantasizing, and it's a different thing to lying. And knowing those things is really important with morality as well, to keep those kinds of moral boundaries, but allowing sufficient creativity. Again, it's a balancing act, isn't it, like anything?
The way I think it's an excellent question. It does go a bit back to what Alex was saying about the nonverbal before. And I think we should go back to the central aspect of the sharedness part, and how that is crucial in moral learning. And that's because, the question is absolutely right that we spoke a lot about spoken language, right? But what I think is crucial, or what we're talking about, conversations, is communication, right? And spoken language and communication are not identical. So, for example, there's a lot of work done in developmental psychology on what's called proto-communication. So before the child learns how to speak, so conversations don't come out of nowhere. Conversations are an ability to have a conversation, comes from somewhere. It's developed, the ability. So where does it come from? And so there's a huge debate in developmental psychology and philosophy on sort of whether we can talk about forms of communication in the pre-verbal. So for example, especially sort of they ask questions of whether we can talk about communication before the 9 months old. So in infants who are younger than 9 months old, right? So this is the big question. Is there communication going on or not? Is the dyadic exchange between a caretaker and an infant who is younger than 9 months old a form of communication or not? Is there sharedness between them? So the dominant view is that no, there's absolutely no sharedness and no kind of communication in sort of dual going both ways before the 9 months. And instead others want to say, yes, there is a form of communication going on there, right? And whether there's communication or not, I think one thing that is difficult to deny is that the ability to enter a conversation once one has learned how to speak has something to do with the kind of dyadic attachment relation that was going on before. So I think that if moral learning is sort of constituted by the ability to come to share thoughts and language about one's emotions and meaning and so on and so forth, then there must be a connection between the development in those pre-verbal stages, and because dyads pre-verbally are not all the same. They can be qualitatively very different. So how do these different attachments, dyads pre-verbally influence then one's ability to enter certain kinds of conversations where moral learning is happening? So I definitely think that so much more has to be explored in the pre-verbal, even talking about stuff like moral learning.
Zoe was very keen to make a point about embodied forms of learning and an embodiment as a language, as well as verbal stuff. When you went back to the shared experience, that reminded me of my other question, and I'm not sure you need to ask it now, but talking about the distinctively human shared experience, of course, raises the philosophical question about the post-human, particularly when we're thinking about our engagement with the natural world. But don't feel like you have to answer that now, because it's getting late, and that's a big can of worms that one could open up around that. I think I want us to give you one last opportunity to speak, both of you. And it's a bit like when you're in an interview and you say, is there anything that you really wanted to come and talk about today and you didn't get the chance? So perhaps a final word from both of you, reflecting on this very, very rich and fascinating conversation we've had this afternoon. One final thought that you'd like to offer us. Alex, perhaps first, and then we'll give Daniel the last word.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I know I'm standing in for somebody, but it's been really, really, as these things always are, educational for me as well. So, you know, listening to the talks today have been fascinating and really, really thought-provoking. I just wanted, as on the back of what Daniel was saying there about pre-verbal communication and proto-conversations, I think this idea of mirroring and like having clean mirrors is really, really important, and to be able to bracket off our feeling sometimes phenomenologically as practitioners. So, you know, we talk about phenomenology as a methodology and research methods, but actually being able to bracket off our emotions when we're with children is just as important in a kind of therapeutic context. And so when we're looking at universality of morality, has a ring to it, doesn't it? But the universality of morality and that intersubjective process, I think that the analogy of a clean mirror is really, really important, so that we can avoid those distortions which naturally create toxic cycles sometimes, and that can happen even from a very, very early age. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that point, and just to again say thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm glad it's been useful to people.
Well, I want to thank Alex for being here. It's been absolutely amazing to have this dialogue. I think I would like to end on that final slide on morality and well-being that I really didn't say much about, and of course I can't say so much now, but sort of the one thought that I would like to express, and it's more of a hunch because I'm sure that many people will find controversial, is that once again, when we think about the moral learning outcome of children, or rather everyone's from early childhood onwards, and when we're trying to assess, say, children's moral learning and moral development through frameworks, so on and so forth, I think there's really something to the idea that we shouldn't just aim for the prediction of what we take to be pro-social behavior. But if we bring in the well-being, so our question is, can the child understand her own emotions? How does the child fare in understanding someone else's emotion? What is the range of words that the child uses to describe one's own sort of self-understanding of the emotions? And how does that make them feel about it? So where we bring in an element of well-being as partially an outcome of the moral learning rather than prediction, this and that. I think there is a lot to gain because the well-being will bring that intrinsic motivation that the people who talk about prediction really are after, ultimately. So I think we should definitely start bringing more centrally this idea of emotional well-being into questions of moral learning in early childhood education.
Excellent. Well, I'm really sorry to have to bring this fascinating exchange to a close, but we've only got a couple of minutes left before the end of the session. I wanted to make sure I had time to thank everyone who's been involved in today. Our presenters, Daniel, early Katrina, Alex in the second half of the event, who've worked so hard and so brilliantly to bring all this together. I'd like to thank Nikki for chairing the first part of the session and fellow SIG co-conveners, Meta, others at BERA for all their hard work in helping to organise the event, manage the publicity and the dissemination afterwards. Just a final note that the sessions have been recorded and will be added to the BERA website in due course. And I think this will be a fascinating and brilliant resource for anybody who didn't have the privilege to actually be here and listen to it and contribute in person. So thank you very, very much indeed to everybody. Well done.